November 10th, 1898. Sunrise over Wilmington. North Carolina looked calm. The Cape Fear River was still. Church bells rang like any other Thursday morning. But by sunset, the streets of that same city were soaked in blood painted in smoke, and ruled by men with rifles in their hands and white supremacy in their hearts. This was not a riot. This was not a misunderstanding. This was the day a mob carried out the only successful coup d'etat in United States history, right on American soil, against a government that the people had lawfully elected. Picture this. You are walking down 4th Street in Wilmington, close to the corner of Nunn Street, just after 11 in the morning. You hear gunshots snapping through the air. You see men you recognize, businessmen and former Confederate officers, marching with rifles and pistols, some still wearing faded gray uniforms under their coats. Ahead of them, at a 2-story building known as Free Love Hall, the only black-owned newspaper in the city, the Daily Record is about to vanish from history in flames. Inside that building, just days before, Alex Manly, a black editor born in 1866 and educated the grandson of an enslaved woman and a white governor of North Carolina, had printed words that challenged the lie at the center of Southern racial politics. He dared to say that black men were not predators. He dared to say white womanhood was not always innocent. For that courage, his press would be smashed, his building burned to the ground, and his life hunted. Around 8 in the morning that day, roughly 500 armed white men gathered at the Wilmington Light Infantry Armory, then marched 4 blocks south toward that building, determined to silence his voice forever. By the end of that day, at least dozens of black residents lay dead, possibly as many as 60 or more. Some historians and later studies say the number could reach into the hundreds, because many bodies were never counted and never recovered. Estimates range from about 14 confirmed deaths to over 300. Hundreds of shell casings later recovered from the streets could not be tied to the exact number of lives lost. What is clear is this: armed white supremacists turned their city into a hunting ground, and the targets were black voters, black leaders, black businesses, and black hope. Now stay with this image. A legitimate city government chosen by the people of Wilmington just 2 years earlier, back in the municipal elections of November 1896, is sitting in office. The government is biracial. It is grounded in a fusionist alliance of Republicans and populists, with black and white officials sharing power. On November 10, 1898, that government does not fall because of votes or debate or policy. It falls because a mob of roughly 2,000 armed white men walks into City Hall, points guns at elected leaders, and forces them to resign at gunpoint. By the end of that same afternoon, a former Confederate officer, Colonel Alfred Moore Waddell, declares himself mayor and installs a new all-white city government. No new election, no ballot boxes, just bullets and threats. And here is the most disturbing part. This did not happen in some far-off dictatorship. This did not happen in a country you hear about in the news and shake your head at. This happened in North Carolina, in the United States of America, on a Thursday in November, less than 35 years after the end of the Civil War. This happened while your great-grandparents were alive. Maybe your grandmother's parents were children when this city burned. This is not ancient history. This is the blueprint that still shapes your neighborhood, your voting rights, and your family's wealth right now. You were never meant to know this story in full. For more than a century, textbooks called it a race riot. They made it sound like black people started trouble and white people just reacted. They hid the planning, the speeches, the documents, the money, and the weapons that turned Wilmington into a war zone. But this was not spontaneous. It was not out of control. It was a well-organized, carefully planned 8-month campaign of white supremacy that ended with a coup. So here is what this video is going to do. Over the next hour, you are going to walk street by street through Wilmington in the late 1800s. You will meet the black doctors, the lawyers, the teachers, the newspaper editors, the dock workers, and the city officials who helped build one of the most successful Black communities in the South. You will see how a coalition of Black and white voters built a multiracial government that was actually working. Then you will see how white supremacist leaders, backed by business interests and political power, decided they would rather burn their own city to the ground than share power with Black citizens. You will see names, dates, addresses, and dollar amounts. You will see the property that was stolen, the jobs that were wiped out, and the way state law changed afterward to make sure nothing like Wilmington's multiracial democracy could rise again. You will see how this coup helped pave the way for Jim Crow laws that lasted through the mid-20th century, and how the logic of that coup shows up today in voter ID laws, polling place closures, and attacks on Black political power in places like Georgia and Texas. This is not a random tragedy. This is a pattern. And here is the promise. When you finish this video, you will never look at the phrase voter suppression the same way again. You will understand why your grandparents left the South. You will understand why your family rents instead of owns. You will understand why some people fight so hard to make it harder for you to vote. And you will understand that your ancestors were not powerless, passive victims. They were citizens. They were builders. They held office. They ran businesses. They built newspapers. They were removed by force. If this story reaches you today, that is not an accident. There is a reason you are hearing it now. In the Black church, there is a saying, God may not come when you want, but He is always on time. The fact that you are learning this in this season of your life at this moment in American history is a divine appointment. Your ancestors survived this for a reason. The truth is rising now for a reason. You are not just a spectator. You are part of what happens next. But before you can understand how this connects to Georgia in 2021, or Texas in 2023, or new laws being passed right now, you need to see what Wilmington looked like before November 10th, 1898. You need to see what they destroyed. You need to see how high Black people had climbed, so you can understand the depth of the fall and the size of the theft. Because once you see that clearly, you will never again believe the lie that Black communities just failed on their own. You will know exactly what was taken. And then you will know what must be reclaimed. Because the real shock is not just what they did in one day. The real shock is how they turned that one bloody Thursday into a 100-year strategy. And when you see that you will never again treat your voting rights as something small, you will see them as sacred. And once you see that you will never let them go. Now let us go back a few decades before the smoke and gunfire. Let us walk into Wilmington when it was still a rising Black city on the Cape Fear. That is where this story truly begins. Before the gunfire on November 10th, 1898, there was a different Wilmington. If you had walked down Front Street in the early 1890s, you would have seen something the white supremacist South said was impossible. You would have seen Black dock workers unloading cargo from ships on the Cape Fear River. You would have seen Black women running boarding houses and small businesses. You would have seen Black doctors visiting patients, Black teachers walking to classrooms, and Black elected officials moving in and out of city offices. Wilmington was not just another southern town. By the 1890s, it was the largest city in North Carolina, with a population around 20,000 people. About 56% of those residents were Black. That means the majority of people in Wilmington were African American, just one generation removed from slavery. Many of them owned their homes. Many could read and write. Many were registered voters. This was not the picture you were given in school of helpless, broken former slaves. This was a community in motion. Walk with this picture. It is a weekday morning in 1895. You stand near the corner of 3rd and Princess Street within walking distance of the courthouse. You watch 3 Black aldermen elected to the city council heading into a meeting. You notice Black policemen on patrol, Black firemen ready at the station, Black workers heading to jobs at the city's 3 Black-owned banks. You glance down another block and see a building where a black health inspector keeps records that protect the community's sanitation and well-being. In this one city, you see black political and economic power actually operating in real time. This did not happen by chance. After the Civil War ended in April 1865, and after emancipation became real, black residents in Wilmington began organizing. They built churches, schools, and social clubs. They registered to vote as soon as they could. They joined the Republican Party, which at that time was the party of Lincoln, and the party most associated with emancipation and Reconstruction. They demanded representation in city government and at the state level. Despite violent resistance, they persisted. By the mid-1890s, a political alliance called the Fusion Movement had taken shape in North Carolina. This Fusion coalition brought together Republicans, who often had black support, and white populists, many of them small farmers and working-class whites, frustrated with the power of wealthy planters and railroad interests. In the 1894 and 1896 elections, this Fusion alliance won major victories, taking control of the state legislature and key local offices. In Wilmington, that meant a multiracial, democratically elected city government that reflected the city's black majority. Think about how radical that was in the eyes of white supremacist leaders. In a southern port city a generation after slavery, black men not only voted, they decided elections. They helped choose mayors, aldermen, sheriffs, and state legislators. Some of those officials were black. Others were white Republicans and populists who openly worked with black voters. The city's economy reflected that power. Black-owned businesses and professionals did not just survive. Some of them thrived. One symbol of that thriving black community was the Daily Record, founded and edited by Alex Manley. His newspaper was not a small hidden leaflet. It was a daily paper that spoke boldly about black issues, politics, and respect. It was considered one of the only, and in Wilmington, the only black daily newspaper in the state. It was printed in a building on 7th Street at a spot known as Free Love Hall, 4 blocks south of the Wilmington Light Infantry Armory, between Nunn and Church Streets. Every copy that left that printing press was a declaration. We are here. We can read. We can think. We can speak for ourselves. Black professionals also made their presence known. Imagine a black physician arriving at a home off Market Street in 1893, carrying his medical bag to treat a sick child. Picture a black lawyer walking into a courtroom on Princess Street to represent a black client in a property dispute. See black teachers leading classrooms in schools built after emancipation, teaching children who had been born free, not enslaved. These were not fantasies. These were documented facts. The very existence of these careers in a majority black city terrified those who believed white domination was supposed to be permanent. Now here is the part that connects straight to your life today. When you hear politicians and commentators talk about black communities failing, about black neighborhoods being poor, about crime and broken families, you almost never hear them talk about places like Wilmington before 1898. You almost never hear them say there were black landowners on the riverfront. There were black bankers issuing loans. There were black office holders controlling local budgets. You never hear them say, "We tore those communities down. We burned them. We ran people out. We rewrote the laws so it would never happen again." But that is what happened. In Wilmington, black people showed what was possible when they had genuine political power and access to economic resources. They showed that a black majority city could govern itself, maintain order, grow businesses, and contribute to the wider state economy. They showed that the old lie, the lie that said black people were unfit for self-government, was just that, a lie. For white supremacists who built their identity and their profits on that lie, Wilmington was a threat that had to be removed. So when you think about your grandparents or great-grandparents leaving the South, do not just picture them running from random hatred. See them as refugees from organized political violence. Some of the families forced out of Wilmington never came back. The state's own later commission estimated that over 2,000 Black residents fled the city after the massacre. They lost homes, they lost property, they lost generational wealth. Many never regained those assets. The wealth gap you see today did not appear out of thin air. It was carved into your family tree by events like this. And yet, even in the face of all that, the story of Wilmington before 1898 should still fill you with pride. Think about what your ancestors achieved in just a few decades after legal slavery ended. From bondage in 1865 to homeownership, banking, and political office by the 1890s. In 33 years. That is less than the time between the year 1990 and 2023. Let that sink in. In the same span of time that took you from cassette tapes to smartphones, your ancestors went from chains to city council chambers. That is how fast they moved when they were given even a sliver of opportunity. In the Black church, people often talk about God lifting up a remnant, saving a faithful few to bear witness. Wilmington in the 1890s was one of those remnants. It was proof that Black leadership could flourish. It was proof that democracy could be multiracial in the South. It was proof that shared power was possible. That is exactly why it was targeted. Because systems built on domination cannot survive living examples that disprove their lies. So remember this whenever someone tries to make Black struggle sound like a personal failure. Say their names in your heart. The Black alderman walking into City Hall. The Black banker sitting behind his desk. The Black teacher locking the school door at the end of the day. The Black editor setting type at the Daily Record. They were not the problem. Their success was the evidence. Their success was the threat. And that brings us right to the people who decided to remove that threat by any means necessary, because Wilmington did not fall by accident. Powerful men in North Carolina had meetings, wrote letters, raised money, and gave speeches laying out in cold detail how they would destroy this multiracial government and lock Black people out of power for generations. But before we walk into November 10th, 1898 itself, and before we stand in those streets with the sound of the Gatling gun echoing in our ears, you need to understand the 8-month campaign that made that violence possible. You need to see the flyers. You need to hear the speeches. You need to feel how they primed an entire white population to believe that killing their Black neighbors wasn't murder, but duty. Because once you see that build-up, you will recognize its echo in the way modern voter suppression campaigns talk today. Different language, different tools, same goal. And when you recognize that echo, you will understand that Wilmington is not just a ghost of the past. It is a mirror being held up to the present. By the time the first shot rang out on November 10th, 1898, the coup in Wilmington had already been set in motion for months. The bullets were just the final step. The real work started earlier that year in speeches, editorials, and quiet meetings, where white supremacist leaders laid out their plan to take back power. Start in the spring of 1898. Across North Carolina, the Democratic Party, dominated by white supremacists, was determined to crush the Fusion coalition that had won control of the state legislature in 1894 and 1896. These Democrats were not just worried about losing elections. They were furious that Black men were voting in large numbers and actually winning political influence. They believed that white rule backed by violence if needed was the natural order. They set out to restore that order. One of their most important goals was Wilmington. It was the largest city in the state, a majority Black city, with a biracial government that proved fusion politics could work. If they could break Wilmington, they could send a message to every other town and city. The message was simple. Black political power will not be tolerated. A multiracial government will not be allowed to stand. So they put together what historians now call the White Supremacy Campaign of 1898. This was not a loose slogan. It was a coordinated effort that included politicians, newspaper editors, business leaders, and paramilitary groups. They used rallies, newspapers, posters, and paid organizers to spread fear and hatred. They painted black men as dangerous, corrupt, and unfit for government. They accused the Fusion government of misrule and incompetence. They promised to save white civilization in North Carolina by any means necessary. You need to hear this clearly. The leaders of this campaign did not hide what they believed. They stood on platforms in cities like Wilmington, Raleigh, and elsewhere, and shouted about white supremacy. They ran newspaper headlines calling openly for white rule. They said that black political participation was a threat to white womanhood, to property, and to the future of the state. And they tied all of this to the upcoming state elections in November 1898. In Wilmington, one of the central figures was Alfred Moore Waddell, a former Confederate officer turned politician and orator. He spoke in Wilmington and other places, telling white audiences that if they could not win at the ballot box, they should win by force. In one speech, he told white men that they should go to the polls and, if necessary, choke the Cape Fear River with black bodies before they allowed black political power to continue. That kind of language was not fringe, it was mainstream in this campaign. At the same time, Democratic newspapers across the state poured out propaganda every day. They printed cartoons showing black politicians as clowns or monsters. They claimed that black men threatened white women, playing on old racist fears. They repeated wild stories about supposed assaults and crimes. All of it was designed to create a sense of emergency, as if white people were under attack and needed to fight back through the election and beyond. Here is where Alex Manly enters the center of the storm. In August 1898, in his black-owned Daily Record, he wrote an editorial responding to a widely circulated speech by a white woman, Rebecca Latimer Felton of Georgia, who had called for lynching black men to protect white women. Manly pushed back. He wrote that many relationships between white women and black men were consensual. He wrote that some white men were careless about protecting their own women. He dared to say out loud what everyone knew, but no white supremacist wanted acknowledged. This editorial exploded like dynamite in white supremacist circles. Democratic newspapers reprinted parts of it, twisting his words to stir rage. They framed Manly as an insult to white womanhood and an example of black disrespect. White leaders in Wilmington pointed to that article as proof that black political and social power had gone too far. They vowed that Manly and his newspaper would be punished. That editorial became one of the most convenient excuses for what they already planned to do. As the state election on November 8th of 1898 approached, the White Supremacy Campaign intensified. Red shirts, white paramilitary groups modeled on earlier terrorist outfits, rode through black communities on horseback, armed and visible. They intimidated black voters. They made it clear that voting Republican or Fusionist would come at a cost. On Election Day itself, reports show that in black precincts, pro-democratic officials threw out Republican ballots, stuffed boxes, and manipulated counts. They used fraud and fear to get the results they wanted. 2 days later, on November 10th, the coup in Wilmington would complete what the election theft had started. But even before that day, the plotters had put their plan in writing. On November 9th, 1898, a group of white leaders in Wilmington drafted what they called a White Declaration of Independence. In that document, they declared that white men would rule the city and that black men would no longer hold office or exercise political control there. They demanded that certain black and white political leaders leave town. They specifically targeted the Daily Record for destruction. Think about that. They literally wrote their intentions down like a contract with white supremacy. A day before the bloodshed, they signed a document announcing that they would overthrow a lawful multiracial government and drive black leaders out. That is not a riot. That is not chaos. That is a coup manifesto. Now connect this to your life right now. When you hear people today claim that voter fraud is destroying America, ask yourself, who is running the campaign of fear? Who was printing the headlines? Who was passing laws that shut down polling places in black and brown neighborhoods? In Texas, for example, new restrictions and reshaped maps in the early 2020s made it harder for urban counties with large Black and Latino populations to maintain easy access to voting locations. In Georgia in 2021, Senate Bill 202 added identification requirements for absentee ballots and limited drop boxes, actions that civil rights groups warned would fall hardest on voters of color. Different century, different tools, but the same basic move. Use fear, change the rules, protect the old order. Back in 1898, the Wilmington plotters also made sure law enforcement would not stop them. The city's white police leadership and key members of the state militia, including the Wilmington Light Infantry, were either part of the plan or willing to look the other way. That meant that on November 10th, the mob would not be facing a neutral or protective state. They would be operating with silent approval. When the coup began, Black residents could not count on the badge or the uniform to protect them. In many cases, those symbols of authority were marching with the attackers. In these months, Black residents in Wilmington knew tension was rising. They saw the red shirts, they read the headlines. But many also believed with good reason that the law and the Constitution still meant something. They knew they had voted. They knew they had followed the rules. They trusted that the United States would not allow an openly announced overthrow of a democratically elected government. They hoped that all the talk was just bluster. But it was not bluster. It was preparation. The election on November 8th gave the Democrats statewide victories in the legislature. It did not by itself remove the local city government in Wilmington. That government was still in place on November 9th. For the coup leaders, that was unacceptable. They had not stirred up thousands of white men, printed countless newspapers, and built a paramilitary movement only to share local power. So they set the final day, November 10th, 1898, the day they would end Black political power in Wilmington by force. And here is the part you need to hold in your mind as we move forward. This was not just about Wilmington. The men behind this coup wanted to send a warning to every Black voter in North Carolina and far beyond. They wanted Black citizens to believe deep in their bones that voting could get them killed. They wanted white citizens to learn that if democracy ever threatened white supremacy, they could use violence and get away with it. In many ways, they succeeded. If you have ever looked at low voter turnout in Black communities and heard someone say, "They just do not care," remember Wilmington. Remember the 8-month campaign to make voting deadly. Remember the families who watched their neighbors murdered for being politically active. Trauma like that does not disappear in one lifetime. It travels through stories, and sometimes through the silence when the stories are too painful to tell. Hold that thought, because you are about to walk hour by hour through November 10th, 1898. You are going to hear the gunfire. You are going to feel the fear of mothers hiding children in swamps and cemeteries. You are going to stand at the door of City Hall when elected leaders are forced out at gunpoint. And then you are going to see how the state of North Carolina turned that day of terror into law. And as you listen, keep one question in your mind. If they could do this in broad daylight in 1898, call it a riot, and bury it in silence for a century, what else were you not taught? What else are they still trying to hide? Now we step into the day itself, Thursday, November 10th, 1898. The sun rises over Wilmington around 7 in the morning. For Black residents, many of whom are still processing the harsh, statewide election results from 2 days earlier, this feels like a tense, uncertain day, but not yet a war. They do not know that a mob is already forming. Around 8 in the morning, several hundred white men begin gathering at the Wilmington Light Infantry Armory, a building that holds weapons and uniforms for the local militia. Some are members of the Wilmington Light Infantry. Others are red shirts and local white citizens, including former Confederate soldiers and prominent businessmen. Eyewitness accounts later estimate about 500 men in this first group. Many carry Winchester rifles and pistols. Some have access to a rapid-fire Gatling gun, an early machine gun capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute. From the armory, this armed crowd marches south a short distance toward the Daily Record office in Free Love Hall, located about 4 blocks away between Nunn and Church Streets, just off 7th Street. That building, a modest 2-story structure housing Alex Manly's newspaper, has become a symbol in their minds of everything they hate and fear about Black advancement. They believe that if they burn the Record, they can burn away Black political voice itself. By the time they reach the building sometime after 8:30, Manly is not there. He has already fled the city, warned that his life is in danger because of the August editorial and the rising tension. The mob does not care. They storm the building. They smash the printing presses. They scatter type and paper. Then they set the place on fire. Flames climb the wooden frame, black smoke curling into the morning sky. Neighbors watch in horror. The only Black-owned daily newspaper in the city, and one of the very few in the state, is gone within hours. Pause there. A newspaper is not just ink and paper. It is a record of events, a platform for opinion, a tool for organizing. When they burned the Daily Record, they were not just punishing Alex Manly. They were trying to erase a voice that could document what was about to happen next. They wanted to control the story both inside Wilmington and far beyond. After the fire, the mob does not go home. Their numbers grow. By late morning, around 11 o'clock, roughly 2,000 armed white men are reported in the streets of Wilmington. They fan out through Black neighborhoods, especially the area around Brooklyn and other districts north and west of downtown. Some move along streets like 4th, 6th, and 7th, shooting at Black residents they encounter. Many of the victims are unarmed men going about their day, some on their way to work, some standing outside businesses or homes. Gunfire erupts across the city. Witnesses later describe scenes of terror. Black men shot down in the open, bodies left in the street. In some cases, white mobs break into homes, dragging men out in front of their families. The rapid crack of rifle shots mixes with the occasional brutal roar of the Gatling gun, used to fire into clusters of fleeing Black residents. People run in every direction trying to escape the city, or find hiding places in nearby woods, swamps, and cemeteries. How many people die that day? The official early counts claimed numbers as low as about 14 Black deaths, but that number never matched survivor testimony. Over time, historians and commissions, including a state-sponsored study in the early 2000s, gathered evidence suggesting that at least 60 Black residents were killed, and possibly far more. Some researchers and community accounts put the potential toll between 60 and 300 lives. What is certain is that dozens of Black men were slaughtered in a matter of hours, and many deaths were never recorded in official documents. While the killing unfolds in the streets, Black families make desperate choices. Some mothers gather children and run toward the Pine Forest Cemetery, using tombstones and trees as cover. Others flee toward the swamps outside town, wading into cold, muddy water and thick underbrush to hide. Reports from the period and later research say that hundreds, even thousands of Black residents spent that night and the next several days in the woods and wetlands around Wilmington, afraid to return to their own homes. Imagine that. You have worked for years to buy a small house in Wilmington, maybe on a side street not far from the river. You have a steady job. Your children attend school. One morning, you hear gunfire. By evening, you are lying in a swamp, your children shivering beside you, listening for footsteps, praying that dogs or armed men do not find you in the dark. You do not know if your husband, your brother, your father is dead or alive. You do not know if your home is still standing. You only know that your city has turned against you. At the same time that ordinary Black citizens are running for their lives, the coup leaders are carrying out the second part of their plan. They head for City Hall. There, the lawfully elected Fusionist leaders of Wilmington still technically hold office, including the mayor and several aldermen. The mob does not wait for legal procedures. They take armed men into the building, confront those officials, and present them with an impossible choice: resign now on the spot or face violence. Under the direct threat of guns, the Fusionist officials sign resignation papers. They are not allowed to consult voters. They are not allowed to follow any established legal process. They are simply forced out. Some of them, both black and white, are then escorted to the train station and marched onto departing trains with clear warnings: do not come back to Wilmington. If you return, you will be killed. These expulsions target black leaders and white Republicans who had supported black political participation. With the old government literally removed at gunpoint, the coup leaders moved to install a new one. By that same afternoon, Alfred Moore Waddell stands ready to take the position of mayor. He and his allies appoint new aldermen and officials, all white, all aligned with the White Supremacy Campaign. Within hours, a multiracial, democratically elected government has been replaced by an unelected one-race regime. No new election is held. No court steps in. No state or federal authority stops this. Pause and let that settle in. The United States government, which had fought a civil war supposedly to preserve the Union and later to protect basic rights for freed people, allows an armed mob to overthrow a local government and massacre citizens with no meaningful punishment. State authorities in North Carolina do not arrest the coup leaders. Many of those men go on to high office, serving in positions of power for decades afterward. In other words, the state rewards the coup instead of condemning it. That is why historians and legal scholars now describe Wilmington 1898 as the only successful coup d'etat on American soil. It meets every test. A lawfully elected government was removed by force. Armed groups acting outside normal law seized control. A new government was installed without a legal election. And the higher levels of government tolerated, even embraced the outcome. Meanwhile, the human cost continues to unfold. Beyond the dozens of black people killed on that single day, the aftermath sees a mass exodus. Estimates from later research suggest that about 2,100 black residents leave Wilmington in the days and weeks that follow. Many never return. Black businesses close or move. Black workers lose jobs. Property is sold off under duress or simply taken. Black literacy rates, which had been climbing, begin to fall. The impact is not just physical. It is political, economic, psychological, and spiritual. This is where the long shadow of Wilmington reaches you today. When you look at cities where black populations are smaller now than they were a century ago, or where black-owned businesses are rare, remember that those numbers are not natural accidents. In Wilmington, the black share of the population dropped dramatically over the next century. Today, instead of a black majority, the city's black population sits under 15%. That shift did not happen only because people looked for jobs somewhere else. It happened because people were run out by state-tolerated terror. If this truth is hitting you right now, pause the anger for just a second and do something with it. If you are watching this and you feel that tightness in your chest, that sense of, this cannot be real, but you know it is, then lean in. Right now, before you forget, drop a comment that says, truth. Not for the algorithm alone, for your ancestors, to say I hear you, I see you. I will not let this be buried again. And if you are tired of the lies in your history books, if you are done with the soft language that calls this a riot instead of a coup, tap that like button. Not for ego, for mission. Every like pushes this story further into timelines they never wanted it to reach. Share it with someone who still believes black people just did not work hard enough. Let them see what happened to a black community that did everything right and still faced the gun. Because the real shock is still coming. You have seen the flames at the Daily Record. You have walked past the bodies on 4th Street. You have watched a mayor resign with a gun pointed at his head, but you have not yet seen what the state of North Carolina did next. You have not yet seen how lawmakers took the spirit of that mob and turned it into written law that lasted for generations. And what happens next proves they knew exactly what they were doing. It proves this was never just about one day of hatred. It was about rewriting the rules of American democracy for the entire 20th century. So stay right here, because when you see what they passed after Wilmington, you will understand why your grandparents had to fight so hard just to register, why your parents stood in line for hours during the civil rights era, and why even now, in the 21st century, they are still closing polling places in black neighborhoods. This next truth will shatter everything you were taught about American history.